Hi guys, this is Igor from Vinousreverie, the shop for the adventurous wine drinker, and welcome to our show with Kevin Wank. He's going to join me in a second. Everything you ever wanted to know about wine, but were afraid to ask. We have a fun little topic today. We're going to discuss philosophy in winemaking, California. So I think it's a fun topic. Kevin has obviously experience in Europe. He imports wines from Europe, and he lives in Napa Valley. So he's got kind of observations about how people in Napa Valley make wine. So hi, Kevin. Great to see you again. Thank you for joining the show. I think it's going to be a fun topic today.
Well, hi, Igor, and thank you for your idea about what we're going to talk about today. And yeah, it is interesting with myself having a house in Napa Valley. So I know a lot of the local vintners. I know a lot of the local wines, and in my opinion, Napa Valley is attempting to make good wines. One of the principal differences, though, is there's a significantly higher cost of production in California, than in a lot of these wine regions, in Europe. I mean, one of the principal reasons why I decided to do what I'm doing,
Yes.
was, I just found that the prices in Europe, in what are traditional farming areas are far less than what the prices are in Napa Valley, which is an hour and a half from the Bay Area, and is affected by the overall inflation in things as simple as just land prices. I mean, nobody's looking to build resorts or condos in an area even like Burgundy.
Yeah.
I mean, this is like farmland, and it's regarded as a national heritage, to the to the residents of those countries, where an alternative use of the land in Napa Valley is, let's build houses and sell them for $1.5 million each on little quarter-acre lots. I mean, nobody's trying to do that in Bordeaux or Burgundy. And that's why, to begin with, there's a significant difference in what a lot of the prices are of the wines. Between the wines produced in Northern California and the wines produced in Europe. But another significant difference is the culture and the heritage behind wine production. I mean, and one of the things that is notable is that in the U.S., wine is classified as an alcoholic beverage. In the EU, it's not.
Yes.
It's a food, and I mean, and it's obvious it has alcohol, and everybody knows that, and frankly, I think there's less problems with alcohol in general within the EU. I mean, there's always people that like to drink a little bit more than other people, and and have and maybe get drunk or something. But it's like alcohol in the EU, or wine in the EU, although it has alcohol, is regarded as part of your meal.
Yeah.
Where here it's regarded as like a beverage you drink. As I said, it's obvious that all this has alcohol in it. We all know what the effects of alcohol are, and some people like that more than the wine, and some people enjoy the wine more than the alcohol. That's their choice. But the other part of how wine is regarded in the EU, in addition to it being officially categorized as a food product, is a fascinating part of all of this. Is that as you go region by region, the wines pair really well with the regional cuisine. I mean, one of the funniest experiences I ever had, and this was from a region that's kind of obscure in Southwest France. Southwest France is this sort of amorphous area, between Languedoc and Bordeaux, midway between the Mediterranean Sea, and the Atlantic. But there was a small appellation called Coteau de Quercy, which, even though it's not very well known, it's pretty interesting because it is a limestone plateau that some geologic event pushed up out of the earth, that somebody figured out that Cabernet Franc grows really well on this limestone plateau, in an area that is otherwise known for Malbec, given that Cahors is only about 15 miles to the north.
Yeah.
But I was tasting wines, and in one of these producers in Coteau de Quercy, one of the wines, it was kind of interesting, but it was kind of rustic. And I keep thinking to myself, given my focus on food pairings, what would I pair this with? And so I keep sipping on the wine, thinking, what would I pair it with? So I finally, said to my host, Francis, Francis, quel vous mangez avec ce vin? Francis, what would you eat with this wine? And it looked like I made his day.
Yeah.
He comes out with this big smile.
Yeah.
Oh, Chevreau.
Yeah.
I'm thinking, Chevreau? I'm like, I've seen a lot of weird stuff on French menus, but Chevreau? What is this guy talking about?
Yeah.
And so then I start thinking, Chevre? Is he talking about goat? Chevre, goat cheese.
Yes.
And it's like, yeah, the guy's talking about roast goat. And and that is a specialty in this particular area. So this particular wine that, was a blend of Cabernet Franc and Malbec, was just perfect for roast goat.
Yeah.
I don't think there's much of a market for that here, so I didn't select the wine. But I mean, that's just an example of how region by region they make wines in a style that match the local cuisine.
Yes.
And it's great as you're traveling through Europe, which hopefully we'll be able to do again soon.
Yes.
I have my own trip to Europe planned for June. I'm waiting to see if I can actually do it.
Right.
I need to taste new vintages.
Yes.
But whether it's France or Spain or Italy, region by region, every one of these wines pairs well with the local cuisine.
Yeah.
And that's a fascinating part of it. And, particularly in an area where you can't travel, I mean, you can go buy these local wines that allow you to essentially visit those areas. Everybody who has traveled to Europe has their story about, oh, we had a delightful dinner here and there, and the food tasted so good, and the wine tasted so good. Well, I'm sure both tasted good, but part of the magic of that is how they tasted together.
Yeah.
And that is part of the overall just sensory experience of why European wines are so enjoyable. Again, I do not want to trash California wines at all. And as I think I've probably said in earlier sessions we've had, about a third of my wines personally are California wines. I love the big bold flavors. I love the fact that, frankly, they are probably the best fruit that exists in the wine business worldwide for an interesting reason. The growing conditions here are perfect. I mean, the weather in Europe is extremely variable.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't even know what's going to happen to the 2021 vintage, in France, because there was a cold spell about 2 weeks ago where the entire country was plunged into temperatures between like 5 and 15 degrees Fahrenheit. There's entire wine regions that claim they're not even going to have any wine at all this year.
I do, yeah. I think everything for Alsace was damaged to a large degree.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it was Chablis, Burgundy, Alsace, even Bordeaux.
Yeah. I
mean, Bordeaux, you look at, it's, should be warmed by the maritime climate, off the Atlantic Ocean with the Gulf Stream, coming up from from the Caribbean. I mean, Bordeaux had the same thing. I mean, they had temperatures in Bordeaux of 20 degrees Fahrenheit for a week. And their initial reports out of Bordeaux that they've lost like 30 to 40% of the crop this year. Yeah. Because the vines were already starting to bud. And although you can have frost events in Northern California, the weather is much more, much more consistent. Not just in terms of the early spring when the vines are budding, but all through the growing season. I mean, there are almost perfect growing conditions for wine grapes in Northern California. I mean, it's like grapes like to struggle. I
Yeah.
mean, they build, character by being, starved of nutrients and starved of moisture. And, here, I mean, we basically have no rain all summer.
Yeah.
So you end up with grapes with like big, deep flavors from
Yeah.
Northern California, but there's something else that is unfortunately missing. Although in hillier areas, you will get more minerality in the wines.
Yes.
Think of what of what most vineyard areas in Northern California look like. It's flat farmland.
Yeah.
And these are areas where the minerality in the soil has leached out long ago. And I mean, my own perspective on this is what led to what I would call the California style.
Mhm.
And the Europeans, do of course use oak barrels. I mean, worldwide for wine maturation, 60% of the barrels used are from France. And so the Europeans obviously use barrels to mature wine. Typically, however, with more neutral toasts to them. They may be
Mhm.
new barrels, but they do not have specific toasts which impart flavors or aromas, to the wines. But in Northern California, you have all this flat farmland, but with perfect growing conditions,
Yeah.
and you grow these really healthy, rich-tasting grapes, but without a lot of minerality, which provides depth and structure to those flavors. So how do you then provide depth and structure? Well, use a combination of cultured geese
Mhm.
and a lot of new oak. And in Europe, you don't need to do that because region by region has, its own specific set of minerality, that in itself imparts, flavors, structures, and aromas and characteristics, to the wines. And as I've described, as you go region by region, given that wine is regarded as a food product to accompany the local cuisine, you have this, just almost perfect pairing between the local wines and food. And I mean, wine is fun to sip on. And I'm sure Europeans in a lot of places sip on wine too. But the main way that wine is consumed in Europe is with meals. It's not
Yeah.
just like looked at as a beverage of, oh, let's pop open a bottle of wine and just sip on some wine for a little bit. And the people that I've met in each individual region, they seem to feel like they've got two sets of responsibilities. One, typically, the land that they're farming has been in their families for generations.
Yeah.
I mean, on average across my portfolio, the producers have owned the land for anywhere from 150 to 300 years.
Yeah.
The current generation looks at themselves as both a custodian of the land that their ancestors have taken care of for all that time, but as identified by their presence in that particular region, they also look at themselves as the custodian of the heritage of their own region. What sort of traditions do we have? What kind of cuisine do we have in this region? How do we continue to make wine that matches, what people want to eat in this region? And, that's a fascinating part of this. I mean, the French, word terroir, which is a combination of, the minerality in the soil and the typical weather patterns, I don't think it really goes, far enough, or because I'm describing the regional cuisine. I mean, Italy itself is fascinating
Mhm.
because as Americans we think of Italian food,
Yes.
spaghetti and meatballs,
Yeah. Yeah.
something like that. Well, frankly, I'm not sure how much spaghetti and meatballs is even consumed in Italy.
Or pizza.
Yeah, I mean, pardon me?
Or pizza, right? I mean,
Yeah, or pizza.
yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, what is underappreciated about Italy is once you start going down the peninsula from the north of Italy, I mean, there's almost no part of the peninsula that's more than about 45 minutes from the either Tyrrhenian Sea on the west or the Adriatic Sea on the east. And, most of Italy is eating seafood,
Yeah.
not spaghetti and meatballs,
Yeah.
and that, that, is attributable to what, in my opinion, is the nuanced delicacy of a lot of Italian wines. I mean, even the reds. I mean, I get all these seafood pairings from most of my reds. From Italy. Well, why is that the case? Well, you're 45 minutes from the coast. Regardless of where you're producing wine. Unless you make the wine that's going to go well with seafood, even if it's a red, it's just not going to sell. And, I don't know if this is a, chicken or an egg kind of thing as to whether they make the wines in that style because, they have their own, requirements of like, well, we need to make something that's going to sell, or they want to make the wines in a style that is going to go well with the local cuisine.
Yeah.
But that is not high, in my opinion, on the list of priorities, in Northern California. And you've got, an area which I've described, which, in my opinion, other than where you get up into some of the hillier sections, you just don't have much minerality in the soil. And you've got these, frankly, big fruit bombs that are created in almost perfect growing conditions. Well, how do you make them interesting? Well, you use a lot of new oak, you use cultured yeasts, and, they may seem, interesting to sip on, but, I don't know how many California wines, because of, the, very strong, like, kind of fruit content in the wines, they sort of overwhelm the food. I don't know if it be considered a flaw that in Europe every growing season you have difficult challenges, making the, growing grapes that you can make in interesting wines, but somehow people do it, and what is governing that is what I've continued to talk about, which is it has to go well with the food. If it does not go well with the food, the local residents will not buy those wines. And that is your main target audience for these wines. Another fascinating part of what I do in working with small regional wineries, where most of the wines don't even leave their own regions,
Yep.
is some insights into the economics of all of this. And where their costs are lower because they don't have to hire an export director.
Mm-hmm.
It's like most of the wines that I'm sourcing from Europe have never been exported at all. So they don't have some big sales department, and the associated costs with all of that, and I mean, pre-COVID, anyway, they don't have some sales managers that's flying worldwide trying to sell their wines to places. And so their overall cost structure is lower to begin with, in addition to what I described earlier, that these are out in agricultural areas in Europe that are not subjected to land price inflation the way, the vineyards in Northern California have been subjected to land price inflation. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Yeah, you finish your thought, but I kind of have thoughts too, because you said, I was taking notes. You were saying things, and I think you will partially hit the nail on the head with your last couple of statements. But I'll let you finish about the inflation.
Well, one of the things I've described is the current generation taking care of these families, family estates. Look at themselves as the custodian or the guardian of those estates. But there's another interesting aspect of that. Just a minute ago, I described that no, they didn't hire the 5 different people to be their export department and have the associated costs of that. But given that they've been living on this land, or their families have been living on this land for 100, 150, 200 years, they don't even have mortgages. They don't have. Sorry, can you all see me?
Yeah, we can see you. Looks like you froze for a second.
Sorry, the problem with smartphones is sometimes they're not all that smart. You know, they do weird things, but you know, it's just interesting for me to visit winery by winery and see the difference in the cost structures between, you know, what I see in Northern California and what I see in these, you know, much smaller, you know, regionally oriented wineries in Europe. And, you know, as consumers, take advantage of that. You know, and it's like, you know, on one hand, I want to support our local wine industry too. You know, but one of the principal reasons I did this, yeah, you know, is, you know, as I, you know, traveled around Europe in the summer of 2017 and tasted all these very expressive local wines, I'm thinking, you know, this would retail in the U.S. for $20, and it's the equivalent of something in the U.S. that would cost $50 or $60. You know, and so, I mean, why not try to bring these wines, you know, to the U.S., you know, and then you know, get into the other characteristics I've described tonight about how they're much more food friendly. You know, I think in other episodes we've already gone into, you know, discussions on, and, you know, that in many cases they're lower in alcohol, and, you know, that's, you know, I think helps a little bit. You don't get quite so hungover. I should mention that. You don't get hungover drinking wine, do you, Igor? I don't think so. Yeah.
Bottle. So, but Kevin, you know, thanks for promoting our previous episodes. I think that's the important thing to do. So if you guys want to go back, we have a bunch of fun information. And Kevin, you know, he travels to a lot of these countries because he imports a lot of these wines to the U.S. So he has a great depth of knowledge. And the other thing is, if you guys have kind of questions or comments regarding what we're talking about, I think, you know, we'll see them, and I think it may make the conversation more dynamic. But Kevin, you know, it's funny. I took a couple of notes, so I want to jump like maybe topic by topic for what you were talking about. And you mentioned something: the costs are lower. So the one thing I hear all the time: oh, well, the land is so expensive in California. That's why wines are so expensive. And I always thought that was a bogus argument. I never bought into it. And one of the reasons I never bought into it, I read, maybe this was 10 years ago. So you know, it was some time to it. But the assistant winemaker from David Cafaro, which is a winery based in Dry Creek, he basically said, like, these wines are overpriced that are here in California. And he said, like, knowing the cost of the wines, he said, if you buy the most expensive grapes in California, and if you hire the top quality winemakers in California, and you decide to make all the wine in brand new oak, you would still be profitable at $20 a bottle.
Yeah.
And I totally believed what he was saying. So when you see, you know, when you go to wineries and you see $50 bottles, and then astronomically going up from that, I always read that story in mind. I was like, man, is that what's happening? They're building up all these fat. And you're right. Now they have like big wineries. They have you know, export teams. So they have these additional costs. But there's like a problem with what I think the wineries are creating. I think they're creating the image that the more expensive wines, the better they are. That's it, right? Like, they don't want to create an image. Well, our wines are just as good as European wines that are 3 times less expensive. But you know, we have you know, beautiful views, and we have an export team. That's why you have to pay 3 times the price, right? They have to give you the illusion that the wines are actually better. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the issues in all of this is, frankly, I think for most consumers, it is difficult to differentiate between all these products.
Yes.
And you know, in some respects, it may seem a little simpler in Northern California because you don't have the wide variety of grape varietals that you have, you know, in Europe. But still, every wine is different from every other wine. And so how does the consumer sort through that? And one thing that, in my opinion, aside from, you know, what I have described as higher land prices in general, is the contributing factor is there's a huge amount of money here in the Bay Area. Lots and lots and lots of money have been made by people here in the Bay Area. And so, the wineries know that, and, if you've worked hard and put through all the, long hours and sacrifice, it takes to then, end up being successful and earning a lot of money, the average person wants to feel like, oh, I want to enjoy that. I want to be able to buy things that, that make me feel fulfilled, that I put in all those hours. And so the wineries just eat that up. Okay, we're going to raise our $80 bottle of wine to $100 a bottle. There is a well understood phenomena in consumer behavior that some people feel more satisfied paying more for stuff. I don't want to get into that. But in an area where a huge amount of wealth has been created, such as what has happened here in Northern California, the wineries have, tried to get, as much of a piece of that as they can, and, it's like, you have this big elaborate bottle that you bottle it in, and you have this fancy packaging that you package it in, to make people, feel better, about paying $150 for a bottle of wine, and, if they enjoy that, I do not want to be too judgmental. But, when I taste, like basically 1,000 wines a year, and, have to immediately differentiate, but, between all of them. And then I remember the various things I've tasted from Northern California, most of them aren't much better than the, $20 to $25 bottles of wine that I'm buying in Europe. I'm not buying them for 20.
I'll help you out. I'll help you out, Kevin. They're worse.
I'm trying to be nice, Igor.
No, but Kevin, I guess what I'm trying to make is that I think consumers create narratives for themselves, helped by the marketing industry, and then they kind of, sometimes they push the narrative on me, and they want me to be agreeable with that, and I'm like, I don't care how much money you spend on the wine, but you can't tell me that because you spend more money on the wine that it's better. Because I know for a fact, because like we're in the industry, we taste a lot of the wines, and even like on Instagram, I see a lot of people who are selling wines, and the same thing, Kevin. How pretty is the label? They try to put like a pretty girl next to the wine, and so like, oh, the wine must be good. A pretty girl is holding it, kind of things like that.
Yeah.
And it's creating these illusions which are not true, which show that you could charge for a higher price point. But I'll give you a concrete example, Kevin. I think you get a kick out of this one. So I guess during the last year, many of the wineries could not sell their products, especially the more premium products. So for one of the things that I know in the industry is that if it's a premium wine, like you're charging premium money for it, and during recession, you don't want to drop the price point, because once you drop the price point, you won't be able to bring it up. So you have to hide that product. So you either sell it off to somebody else, or you cellar it, or whatever you do, you could not lower the price. That's like a cardinal sin to lower the price. So a big wine store in Bay Area, I noticed that they started pushing their own private label wine. A private label means that it's a wine that's labeled under the retailer's name. Like Trader Joe has private label, Kirkland has a private label. So this is a wine shop, and they were so ecstatic. They're like, oh, this is a private label wine, but this exact wine got 95 points from Robert Parker, and it retails for $65, but we're selling to you guys for $30. And they had the review, so they were basically, so that's what happened. It was excess of that wine, so the winery had to give rid of the wine, so they sold it to this retailer, and they were selling it for $30, right? So that just gives you a little bit of clue. So if they were selling for 30, that means the winery made profit on the wine for $30, and yet they were selling it for 65 in other outlets. So to me, that means it's all fat. I mean, as a retailer, there's no way I have margins like the margins we're talking about right here.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of fat. And the land prices are not that expensive, what that example tells me. And the other funny thing about it is that when they initially, the wine came out from that store, the private label wine, they actually had the whole review. They gave them 95 points. But when I looked at it a couple of weeks later, I saw the review was taken off. And it said, oh, for legal reasons, we could not show the review of this wine. So I thought it was a kick too, because some smart consumers, started, typing the review into Google and probably found out what that wine that was selling for 75.
Oh, that's funny, because you could have like taken a picture of that review and just put in some of the words in the review into a search engine, and then you would have identified who the winery was. On one hand, a lot of the local wineries have been through a very, very difficult time in the last year, because a lot of their sales were through their own tasting rooms, which were closed down, or a lot of the distribution of those wines were directly to local restaurants, which were closed down. So what were they going to do? I mean, I had an interesting experience in the middle of last year where, in March of last year, my sales just skyrocketed.
Yeah.
Initially, I don't think anybody knew anything about what we were venturing into, and people were concerned, whether it was, toilet paper or maybe wine, whether we're going to have anything more of any of these things, and so initially there was hoarding of everything, I guess. But, my sales skyrocketed last year in March and April. And I start looking at my inventories, and I'm realized, like, oh my God, I'm going to run out of wine in a couple of months. So I started reordering, from all of my suppliers in Europe, and the shipments started arriving in June, and my warehouse, which is a really, significant public warehouse in Northern California, whose main clientele are smaller local wineries. The guy in charge of my warehouse calls me one day. He says, how many more shipments do you have on your way? I'm like, why? Is there a problem? He says, yeah, most of our customers aren't selling anything.
Yeah.
And we don't have any room at this point. I'm like, well, I've got, 6 more ships on their way with stuff that is selling. What should I do? He says, we'll try to work through it somehow, but, all of our small local wineries are just not selling anything at this point.
I've heard anecdotes like that, and I've heard shifty deals were kind of made that way. And I think that's part of the reason I gave that example. It's kind of, you can see the shiftiness behind that deal. But Ben had a question. So hi, Ben. Thanks for joining. So me and Kevin, we do this show every 2 weeks where we discuss, we try to demystify different aspects of wine. Sometimes we talk about regions. Sometimes we talk about specific grapes. We've talked about soils. And today's topic is kind of the philosophy between the way Europeans approach wine versus the way Californians approach wine. So that's why you can see this banter. So I'm drinking Roter Veltliner, which is a nice grape that's associated with Austria. So Gruner Veltliner is probably the most famous grape associated with Austria. But this is a Roter, which is a pink skin grape that makes white wine. And that's, I think, par for the course for today's discussion. It's the vast world of wine and how many fun wines there are that retail at great price points and taste much better than any California wine that retails at the same price point, just about every single time.
Yeah, the Austria is not really all that well known in the world of wine. And when you think of Austria, people typically think, oh, Gruner Veltliner. And but there's once people can sorry, I was good. But once people can travel again, there's possibly the most fun place in the world to taste wine and it's in a town called Langenloy, which is an hour and a half, roughly west of 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 Vienna, and on the north side of the Danube, and in the local trade association, there's a tasting area.
Yeah.
And all the local producers have their wines just sitting in refrigerated, cabinets at this tasting area. There's no fee. And, you can just walk into this tasting area and spend hours there until you like fall over, I guess, but, you just mentioned, Roter, Veltliner, which is red Veltliner. Gruner, Grün is green in Deutsch. So Gruner Veltliner is green Veltliner. But, in this little tasting room in Langenloy, I mean, I tasted like probably 30 different Austrian white wine grapes that I had never heard of in my life.
Yeah.
And that shows, the variety that exists, in the wine world, that's interesting to explore. Since you're, drinking the Roter Veltliner, tonight, how would you differentiate what it tastes like versus the typical Gruner Veltliner?
Yeah, I think it's more floral than Gruner, and it definitely does not have that very distinguishing white pepper that a lot of Gruners have.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it's more fruit forward, I think, than the white pepper finish on the palate. A lot of Gruner, I think some Pinot Gris to me also has a white pepper similarities to Gruners, even though they have different profiles. But white pepper I typically associate with Gruners and Pinot Gris, especially maybe Alsatian Pinot Gris.
Yeah. And this is another reason why I think wine is considered a food in Europe. And the California wine industry, was essentially based on about, probably 6 varietals. I mean, Cabernet Sauvignon, Pinot Noir, Merlot, Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc. And it's great that its location is so close to such a populated area, and that people started to explore wine by going, up to Napa or up to Sonoma and starting to, taste, these wines. But, as I just described in this little tasting room in Langenloy, an hour and a half, west of, Vienna, I mean, there was like 30 different white wine grapes that even somebody in the wine business hadn't heard of. And what's fascinating about them all is they all have different aroma and flavor profiles. And that's why I continually describe wine as the world's most interesting consumer product. And that is where I also have an objection to what I call the, California style of wines. And on one hand, we do have less varietals that people are producing in any quantity than are typically, produced region by region, in Europe. But why then use a whole bunch of new oak and similar cultured yeasts to then make these wines basically all taste the same? And I mean, the fascinating part of all of this, is just the variation in flavor profiles that you get from, from all these different varietals. Earlier tonight, I'm adding, probably 8 to 10 regions to my portfolio this year. Primarily focusing on Spain, but also, Italy and a few regions in France too. But, I have a producer, or who's now going to be one of my suppliers in the Bierzo region in northwestern Spain. And, a grape that I think a reasonable amount of people know, but, I guess a lot of people don't, Godello. What's Godello? And, I would almost describe it as a cross between, Sauvignon Blanc, and Semillon. I mean, there's this richness and creaminess to it, but with the minerality of the soils in Bierzo, also has, these sort of rich tropical fruit notes to it. And it's like, that's from a specific place, and that's what makes it interesting. Where you could take Godello and use a whole bunch of new oak and cultured yeast and make it taste like anything. In fact, a grape that unfortunately that's been done to fairly close to Bierzo in a region called Rueda in Spain there's a very, very nice white grape called Verdejo. But Verdejo, has some qualities of Sauvignon Blanc, but it has some richness to it that could also be associated with Chardonnay. And the vintners are puzzled. What should we do with this grape? Well, why don't you just ferment it in stainless steel and let it express itself? And it's like, oh no, there's people that like Chardonnay, so we're going to age it in wood oak barrels like Chardonnay.
Yeah.
Or there's people that like, that like Sauvignon Blanc. So we're going to use cultured yeast and make Verdejo taste like Sauvignon Blanc. I mean, what's the point? I mean, you lose the entire sense of place from these wines that makes them so interesting and fascinating. I mean,
Well, you're alluding to basically economic forces making people kind of think what the public wants and catering to. I don't know if that's what the public wants. It's kind of what you're giving it to the public. So you're sacrificing like history, tradition, strength of the land to cater to kind of economic needs or wants. I don't know because you mentioned Godel. Jancis Robinson, for example, I think she's just about as knowledgeable as anybody else in the world about wine. She mentioned that in her mind it's a noble grape, and she thinks it might be the great white wine of Spain. And she frequently compares the great examples to white burgundies, to great white burgundies, which is kind of the ultimate compliment for a white wine. So that's just the context to the Godeo grape that you're talking about, which people probably never heard of.
I mean, I have, personally, I have a reasonable amount of very high-end white burgundies, and as I'm tasting this Godeo from Bierzo, I'm tasting these Montrachet notes in it, and and this is a wine that's going to retail here for $25. And there's all these notes that are, Montrachet and Merceau like in the wine.
Yeah.
And frankly, it's richer than Chardonnay. And so, maybe some people won't like that because it won't taste like Chardonnay. But it's like a richer expression. I mean, it was almost a bit like a white Hermitage, which is mainly Marsanne.
Yeah.
But I mean, one thing that's fascinating for me, as I focus on native grape varietals and then go region by region, just looking for pure expressions of that, is a subject we talked about before is what does the geology of the area add to all of that?
Yeah.
And it adds a lot.
Yeah.
But that's what's fun about this, because the combination of the regional grape varietals and the specific minerality in the soil related to the geology of the area gives all these wines a specific sense of place and identity. And that's one of the really fun and enjoyable parts of that. And, would you eat the same food every night that was seasoned and flavored the same way? No, you wouldn't. So, why do you just rely on a couple of wines? I mean, that's what that's what's fun about this. There's a tremendous amount of variety. In fact, in doing some tastings with clients today, I mean, a specific client that runs a wine bar said, "Oh, I'd be interested in tasting some light and summery wines."
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, well, what can I come up with?
Yeah.
And it's stuff that frankly nobody's ever heard of. Passerina from Abruzzo, Bombino from Northern Puglia, Verdeca from Southern Puglia, and these were wines that this guy who runs a pretty good wine bar in San Francisco, he had never tasted in his life.
Yeah.
And he said, "God, these are really good. These are just spectacular." He's going to let me know tomorrow, what he's going to order. But he said, I just haven't tasted wines like this. I mean, people keep bringing me the same stuff.
Yeah.
What's the point? What's the point of that? And yeah.
Well, you're talking about gatekeepers now, Kevin, which is a fascinating subject in itself. Because it's funny, you were talking about the Austrian tasting that you had. Just earlier last week, I was invited to an Austrian tasting held by the Austrian Wine Society. So the concept was they invited 12 different retail shops in California, and they invited 12 different winemakers, and the retail shops were given a wine from each winemaker, and then on a Zoom call, the winemakers described each wine to the consumer. And the idea was to teach the retailers about the Austrian wine. So some of the retail shops, there was like a big one from Southern California that you told me that you do business with. And then there were, like I said, shops from San Diego all the way to Northern California. And during the introduction, everybody was asked, what do you know about Austrian wine, your experience with Austrian wine? And for example, there was a shop right here in Northern California when the retailer, he said, I don't know anything about Austrian wine. And a lot of the answers were like similar, like very limited knowledge. And just to give you a concept, I probably knew, I probably had 6 or 7 of the 12 wineries in my shop at one point or another. And I was familiar with most of them. I was familiar with all the grapes. They kind of stayed with like Zweigalt, Blaufränkisch, Gruner Veltliner, kind of the ones that are known. This Roter Veltliner was actually one of the like lesser known varieties there. And one of the winemakers, we actually exchanged back and forth on the Instagram, and she recognized me from that. But what I was kind of trying to make a point is, I always suspected that a lot of restaurateurs and retail shops, the people who work there and make selections, know very little about wine. And so when they know very little about wine, they'll bring in selections that show that they know very little about wine, and they'll try to sell that to the consumers. So it's kind of like this vicious cycle where the retailers don't bring anything new to the consumers, and the consumers don't buy anything because they buy only what the retailers bring. But the retailers are not bringing anything new because they're afraid they can't sell it to the consumer. So I call them kind of the gatekeepers. They're preventing interesting wines from hitting the marketplace. That's why when people go to places like Safeway and Trader Joe, Total Wine, Bevmo, Costco, they basically see the same labels, and people are haggling over like 25 cents. 25 cents or 50 cents, they're like, oh, I'm cheaper by 50 cents. Those guys are trying to rip you off. They're just, that's all you see in all those retail shops. So it's like, oh, okay, look, it's crap, but I'm paying 50 cents cheaper for it. I'm the winner,
Yeah, I mean, the almost sad part about all this is every one of these bottles has alcohol in it. Yeah. And I mean, some people are frankly mainly there for the alcohol, and I don't want to be too judgmental, but wine is so fascinating. As I was, sipping on this, Godello tonight, I'm like, God, I mean, this is just truly remarkable. And I've visited Berzo, and I've seen these just, rocky, desolate slopes. Yeah. And, this particular, winery, I mean, the wines, it tastes like those rocks that I've seen. And another one that I recently added.
Right, Kevin? You say that you're licking rocks. It's just, it brings so much delicious character to the wine.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the ones that are grown in areas with more minerality, they're more refreshing. And I mean, my wines were always really popular in wine bars. And then last March, when everything closed down, I'm like, oh my God, what am I going to do? And then my sales skyrocketed at retail. But there's an interesting reason why they were so popular in wine bar. I mean, we had another segment on minerality, the different types of it. But, it's like the wines grown in areas with higher mineral content, they taste more refreshing.
Mhm.
I mean, it's almost like, drinking this like clear, crisp, refreshing mineral water. You just want to keep drinking it.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, there's alcohol along too, so there's a limit to how much you can drink of it. But they just taste so much better. And the wines, from areas of higher mineral content, they also complement the foods better. And that's why
Yes.
I go back to what I contrasted earlier. It's like most of the wine growing areas in California, on one hand, they've got perfect weather, perfect growing season all summer long, but it's flat farmland.
Yeah.
There's no minerals in the soil, and
Well,
that's, yeah.
no, go ahead. Go ahead. Finish your thought.
I mean, and so that's why, in my opinion, what I call the California style development,
Yeah.
And it's like, I mean, there's like nobody in Europe would consider using 60% new oak barrels.
Yeah.
I mean, I see, bottlings in California where it's 100% new oak. I mean, people in Europe would not even consider doing that. Burgundy, which is considered, possibly the premier wine region in the world. I mean, people get into lengthy discussions about what should we do this year? Should we use 10% new oak or 20% new oak?
Yes.
They would never even contemplate using 60% new oak. But, California Pinot Noir, I don't want to trash Pinot Noir, one of my favorite grapes.
Yes.
But, California Pinot Noir, the typical California Pinot Noir, 40 to 60% new oak
Yeah.
to
It's
try
not.
to make,
It's
yeah,
not.
yeah, yeah. And I mean, it's like, try to make it taste like something. Yeah.
Well, Kevin, I'm listening to this conversation, and there's almost these like fascinating cultural, I don't know, philosophies that are boiling underneath, because what you're talking about. Because yeah, sometimes I have customers who come in and they're like, you know what, I'm looking for a wine that has that they call it like I don't know if you ever heard that term. So
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. To me, that means the wine has to be big, like a Cabernet, full body, high in alcohol, and lots of fruit. That's what I interpret. So there's almost like this. I don't know what to say, like a Wild West mentality. There's I know I'm gonna misquote. I wish I had that quote on hand, but I think Oscar Wilde at one point said that America went from like what was it, like tribalism to sophistication overnight. And I was
Well,
wondering if he was alluding, if there's almost this sense of like the Wild West, where like, yeah, like we want to lick on a 2x4. We don't want to taste the fruit. We want this, like, this oak and like hitting us in the face. We don't want any balance, delicacy. We just want strength and power. I don't know. Maybe that's why American football is only popular in America. Maybe it's all part of that same kind of philosophy.
well, I mean, there's sort of a parallel between American football of, people running into each other and the culture creating these wines that frankly run into you.
Yeah.
I mean, most California wines, they may be fun to open up a bottle and sip on it a little bit, but in my opinion, they just don't pair well with foods. Most of the heavily oaked California Chardonnay, you think of Chardonnay, oh, fish.
Yeah.
Well, most of the heavily oaked California Chardonnays you cannot pair with fish.
Yeah.
I don't know what you'd pair them with.
Yeah.
Maybe they'd pair well with like veal or pork.
Yeah.
Yeah, but Chardonnay is considered a delicate wine in France. It goes well with a lot of seafood. Most of the California Chardonnays, frankly, that are heavily oaked. I mean, anytime somebody starts talking about, I want a big buttery Chardonnay, it's like it just does not go well with seafood. And that's what Chardonnay is supposed to go well with.
Well, Kevin.
The oomph part of it. I mean, human beings are sort of almost like programmed to always want more. But when you can't drink the wines with food, I mean, what's the point of it?
Yeah. Well, Kevin, one of the things, because there's there's thing called palate development. I think the trickiest thing about wine is if you like a particular thing and you taste something that that might be better, you won't recognize it on the first taste because if somebody says like, oh, like I like the big buttery Chardonnay, and somebody's like, oh, you know what, I have a wine that's way better for you, and they're thinking of like, oh, I'm going to introduce them to like a nice balanced Burgundy. But I think to the consumer, they're like, oh my God, if the wine is even better than a big buttery Chardonnay, it must be like a big buttery Chardonnay on crack. You're like even more buttery, right? So when they do something that's more delicate, they're like, I don't really like it. It's it's not what I expected. So I have kind of like a theory about this. I truly believe that if you kind of just kind of almost take a leap of faith and say like, you know what, I think these balanced wines in the end are better than the unbalanced, oaky, buttery, fruit-forward wines that I typically like to drink. I think if you try drinking them not once, but like for 3 or 4 months, I think more people than not, like over 50%, will be converts. And I think they'll eventually phase out and stop drinking the wines that they used to drink in the past. But it's not going to happen over one tasting. There's no epiphanies. It's palate development. And that's how I started. I started drinking California wines all the time. I used to go to Napa, Sonoma, just like everybody does right now. Now I hardly ever drink California wines. It's just tough. Not only because of the price point, a lot of them just don't have this complexity that comes from the minerals, the minerality in the soil that you frequently reference, and it's noticeable. And sometimes I'm like, I can't believe I used to like these wines. That's a frequent thought that I have about some of the California wines that I drink, right now.
A experience that I think would actually accelerate people's realization of that is, cook something like halibut or sea bass and pick out, a white Burgundy, pick out a California Chardonnay, have 2 glasses and take sips after each bite of the, sea bass or the halibut, between, going back and forth, and think to yourself, how does each of these wines complement the food? You'll convert far sooner than your 3 to 4 months of training the palate. You'll realize that the nuances and the more delicate profile of the French Chardonnays go far better with food. Than something that's designed to taste or to have this impressive flavor profile on the first sip. One thing that made my wines so successful in wine bars is you want to keep drinking them.
They're good. These shows are so much fun. I think you booted like in 2 minutes. I think continue for another 20 minutes easily. But before we go, I want to give you a quick story that you get a kick out of. So yesterday, somebody called the shop, and she's like, you know what? I went to a Total Wine, and I asked for a Chacolí, which is like a Basque country wine. And the response I got was like, oh, we don't have it. You won't even find it in California. That's what Total Wine told her. Yeah. So she did a little further research, and she found that we had 2 in my shop. But I'm like, there's the philosophy, right? Total Wine claims that they have every single wine in the world, and the interesting wine they don't have. And, they're like, I think they're thinking like, oh, we have all the wines. If you don't have it, they're probably not worth having. And I would argue like, if you do have something, it's probably not worth having. That's how it was flipped, that thought process. So
that's interesting to hear. Because it's a really fun wine too. It goes great with the fresh seafood, in the Basque region of northern Spain.
Well, they're the ultimate gatekeepers for having not interesting wines. So, but you know, we have a show about that too. That's episode 4, guys. So you go and check it out. All right, Kevin, I
Yeah.
think we concluded. Thank you so much, hey, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Check out our other shows, and me and Kevin will do it again. Thank you, Kevin.
You're welcome, Igor. Have a nice evening.
You too. Bye.
Okay, bye.